So this slideshow is going to cover aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and many other exposure basics. The difference between what we consider one stop is twice or half the light, although I should note that in most modern day cameras it takes 3 clicks of either aperture or shutter or even ISO, I suppose, to give us one stop more light or one stop less light. These are kind of exaggerated illustrations of over and underexposure, but the exposure is made up basically of 3 different things. The larger or smaller size opening at the front of the camera that we call our aperture, the speed at which our shutter is open to let more or less light in, or the ISO, which is the sensitivity that we have set our camera sensor at. Here are some basic examples of ISO, usually the standard or default being 100, which is the native for most cameras, although some go lower, and then increasing it up, doubling would essentially double your sensitivity. So 200, 400, 800, 1600 would go further beyond that with most modern day cameras, but this is built thinking off of film sensitivity. So the higher the number, the more sensitive you're going to have your sensor be. But along with that, you're amplifying the signal in the camera, and so you end up with noise, which kind of looks like grain, but a fuzziness that sometimes is monochromatic, but usually also has some color change mixed in with it. If you want more detail, you want to use a lower ISO. If you want more contrast, you want to use a lower ISO. But you should aim to have a sharp picture that has some noise rather than a blurry picture. And I'll get back to that idea later. So sometimes we set our camera to auto ISO, or sometimes we intentionally set it to a certain ISO depending on our circumstances. Here's an example of what a high versus a low ISO might look like. I think that's pretty obvious. Our next control being aperture. This is a representation of different aperture sizes. So they're not to scale, obviously, but 1.4 aperture, which most cameras don't have, is going to be a very large opening. I would say most cameras these days are going to be somewhere in the 4 to 5.6 range for a kit lens, and they're going to go usually to about 22, maybe even 29 or 32 on the small end. With those numbers, keeping in mind that they're sort of inverse, smaller number is a larger opening, so smaller number lets in more light. It also has less depth of field, meaning that it has a smaller range of what is in focus compared to what you're focusing on. And we'll go into that in more detail later. So if you want maximum light coming in because it's dark out, you want to use the smallest number. Or if you want more in focus, for example, if you're doing landscape photography, you'd probably want more depth of field using a higher number. Here's a not to scale illustration of that. So if you focus on this same bird in all the pictures, if you use a small number aperture, your range of what's going to be in focus is going to be very limited. Whereas at the bottom, if you use a very small hole, your range of what's in focus is maximized. Here's another illustration. I'm not sure that you can see this on the size screen that you'd be viewing this on, but you're focusing on the boy that is in the middle range. There's another boy in front, and there's this older man behind. And with a smaller aperture, the boy in the middle is sharp, but the boy in front and the man behind are out of focus. Whereas if you use a higher number, smaller hole, you can get everything in sharp focus. And then one more illustration, the left one being a very shallow depth of field where the object is sharp, but everything behind it is out of focus. Whereas on the right, everything is generally in focus. Like the bushes in the background are maybe not tack sharp, but they are definitely visually sharper than the other one. Then we move on to shutter speed. So I think this one's fairly easy to understand, although I should say these are meant to be fractions of a second. So you commonly would think of it as being 1 second, half a second, being a 2 inside the camera, a 4 being a quarter second, eighth of a second, 15th, 30th, 60th, 125th, 250th. It goes beyond 1,000 on most modern cameras, but just about everything will be blurry if you're taking a 1 second exposure, anything that's moving, I should say. Whereas if you're taking a 1,000th of a second or faster shutter picture, just about everything that's moving will be frozen. The important thing to remember about this is that your shutter speed to handhold, it needs to be comparable to the focal length of your lens, and we'll get into focal length later, and I'll come back to this idea. But at a 1 second, you'd need to have a tripod. At a 1,000th of a second, you wouldn't. But your camera is going to shake and your body's going to shake, and everything would come out blurry at those lower shutter speeds. All right, then on some lenses, you'll have information like the focal length on it. Well, almost every camera should have the focal length. Usually we're going to have a range. This example is for a prime lens that does not zoom. You'll have a maximum aperture, you'll have a filter diameter size, and usually the manufacturer. So the focal length is the distance in millimeters from the optical center of the lens to the sensor, basically. So if you are using a higher number focal length, you are essentially magnifying the image. Then the other thing is lens speed. So we call a lens faster if it has a lower number maximum aperture, meaning it lets in a lot more light through the aperture, so you can use a faster shutter speed that lets in less light paired with it. So here's an example of some focal lengths and their approximate angle of view, keeping in mind that 50 millimeters is equivalent to normal human vision, at least based on a 35 millimeter sensor. And I have some visuals of this. This might be hard to see, but these are all the same scene with a really wide angle 24 millimeter lens, slowly stepping up in focal length until you zoom really close in on this tower. 1,000 millimeter focal length is a really specialized lens. I would say most cameras are going to have somewhere in the range of 18 to 55 for a kit lens that has a crop sensor, or 28 to 80 is what would be fairly normal on a full frame sensor. If you go much wider than that, like I have a 17 millimeter lens meant for full frame cameras, or if you're using an extreme zoom, those are going to be much more expensive lenses. And here's an example of doing portraiture with different focal lengths. So a 19 millimeter focal length really distorts the face, kind of makes whatever's closest, like the nose, feel large in comparison to the rest of the face. 70 or even around 80, maybe even 100 millimeters is really good for portrait because it doesn't flatten the face too much, like you might notice in the right-hand picture with the 350 millimeter lens. So it gives a good sense of shape without getting kind of weird distortions. And here's one thing I want to remind you all as you're going out to photograph, is that you should not be taking photos from across the street or far away. Try to get as close as you can to take the picture. Be careful not to trespass, but There's this quote by Robert Capa that says, if your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough. So use your feet to zoom in rather than just using the maximum zoom. Try to get a more intimate image by using a wider angle view up close, and will connect to those better than photographing from far away with a big zoom. Related to that, though, I should say that Robert Capa was a famous war photographer, and he died having gotten shot, so he was maybe a little bit too close to the action. Okay, so we've sort of talked a little bit about depth of field, but there's actually three things that affect depth of field. Aperture we talked about already, but focal length and camera to subject distance also will affect how large or small your range of what's in focus feels, your depth of field, in relation to your subject. So here's some visuals of that, using a large aperture versus a small aperture, using a long lens zooming in versus using a short lens. You notice that the background feels more out of focus when you're zooming in with a high focal length lens. And then when you're up close to something, it shrinks the distance. Shrinking shrinks the range of what's going to be in focus. So if you get really close to something, the background is going to be more out of focus if you want it to be. Whereas if you back up a little, you're able to get what's near and what's far in focus more likely. When it comes to what is actually in focus, typically this is an illustration of like you're focused on this dog's nose, and what's going to be sharp in focus is going to be about a third of the range toward the camera and 2/3 the range away from the camera. So you can kind of plan things out with what you want in focus versus what you don't want in focus if you're going for that. All right, so if we put it all together, you can increase and decrease the amount of light based on these three different things: your faster or slower shutter speed, your larger or smaller aperture, and your more or less sensitive sensor with ISO. All right, I have just a few other things to cover. You might notice this effect called chromatic aberration, which happens from using, well, a cheaper lens usually, but using the maximum aperture in the lens gets you to use the more curved part of the lens on the sides rather than what feels more flat in the center. So you'll notice sometimes when you have really high contrast that there might be a red, green fringe, like kind of halo on the edge of objects, but usually it's only when it's really high contrast, like looking up at the sky. So to eliminate that, just don't use the maximum aperture, stop down 1 or 2 stops. The other thing that we sometimes have an issue with is called diffraction, where if you are constantly stopping down the lens, if you have a cheap lens that makes like an octagon shape when it stops down, rather than one of these two on the left are kind of higher quality round blades that make a nice circle when they stop down, versus more of an octagon for these two on the right. So that non-perfect circle will actually make your picture less sharp. And here's an example of zoomed in really close on like a leaf, where you can see the kind of cracks in it, I guess, more clearly in a 5.6, but if you stop down really far to like a 32 or 45 aperture, those start getting blurry because it's a less perfect circle. So you don't ever want to be all the way open or all the way closed, although if you're looking at things on the screen, we're probably not going to notice it. And if you're printing things even up to like 8x10 with a modern day camera, you're probably also not going to notice a huge difference. But just keep in mind that those are possible issues related to the aperture. Now, so the sweet spot would be 2 stops all the way from open to get the sharpest part of your lens and not get that diffusion or diffraction. Related to that, there is, if you're doing landscape photography, the idea of a hyperfocal distance, meaning the nearest that you can focus and still get infinity sharpened focus. So if you want to do a lot of landscape photography, that's something to look into more. And there's actually apps for phones where you can plug in your camera and your lens and your distance, and it'll tell you what to do in order to get a hyperfocal distance and make sure that infinity is sharp. All right, now the biggest issue that we often will see with new photographers is camera shake. So camera shake's really caused from having a slow shutter speed where you won't get a sharp image because your body's shaking. You're holding the camera and it shakes a little bit. And so you need to make sure you're using a fast enough shutter speed or a tripod. And typically what we would do is we would match our focal length to the nearest shutter speed, or the nearest shutter speed, and then go just a little bit up. So if you're working with a 50 millimeter, 55 millimeter lens, you want to make sure that your focal length is at least a 60th of a second, and then it's safe to handhold. And if you can't use that shutter speed, if you have to use a slower shutter speed, then you have to use a tripod. All right, then there is this camera simulator, which I'll click on and see if it works. Ah, there we go, yes. And you can actually play with these different controls before you go out and photograph with your real camera. So I'm gonna just leave my lighting as it is, but you can see I can play with my distance and my focal length to adjust my, to see the depth of field change. But mainly we can change our ISO, our aperture, and our shutter speed. And that can be either on manual, where you can control all three separately, AV for aperture priority, where you control the aperture and it will adjust the shutter speed for you, or TV, which will let you adjust the shutter speed and it'll automatically figure out the aperture. For this first assignment, I think it's fine for you all to be working with AV and TV, but by week 2, week 3, I'd like you to get comfortable using manual exposure for everything. So you can go ahead and snap a photo and see what comes through. And it's basically, well, let me go back to the controls. It's a 60th of a second, so it wasn't fast enough to freeze the windmill, but it was fast enough to freeze the girl's motion and the camera shake. But if I slow down the shutter speed, to like an eighth of a second, and I take a picture, now you're going to see that she's blurry and the background's blurry, and that's because it was slow enough of a shutter speed that I should have used a tripod. Now, in this, you can just click on tripod and it will stabilize it, but in real life, you've got to carry it along with you. And then with aperture priority, you can do the same thing of having a high aperture number, and you'll see that it was forcing a 15th of a second shutter speed, so the picture came out blurry. But if I bring this down to, about a f11, that should give me a lot of depth of field. It should be a matching fast enough shutter speed that she's sharp. There we go. And the background is reasonably sharp. Whereas if I bring this all the way down, well, let's say most of you will have like a 4.5 aperture maximum. If I snap a photo now, the background is significantly more blurry. So this is something that you can just kind of play with each of these settings and kind of get comfortable with what it will look like. And then this simulates fairly well what you're going to see inside of the camera. So our shutter speed, our aperture, our exposure meter, and our ISO. And I'll note that if I switch to manual, then you're going to see the exposure meter going up and down when I change these numbers. And the goal would be to center it out using the right numbers in order to take the picture you want. And for the first project, the main thing, the first half of it, what we're doing is playing with extremes of aperture and extremes of shutter speed in order to see the difference of what they do. Okay, I'm going to close out of that. And I believe, that's all we're going to do for now.